The fog sat low over the street, thick enough to swallow sound. A single boot step echoed, then stopped. Somewhere behind a shuttered bakery, a man waited, pressed flat against brick cold, with winter damp. He could hear the patrol before he saw it, leather creaking, a muted cough, the scrape of a rifle sling against a coat button. No shouting, no commands, just routine, just confidence. The officer came first. Close, too close. The man in the shadows didn't raise a rifle. He didn't draw a knife. He barely moved at all. A small, ugly object appeared in his hand, short, blunt, almost laughable. He stepped forward once. There was no flash, no crack, no warning. The officer folded as if his strings had been cut. The second soldier froze. He didn't hear a shot. He didn't understand what had happened. His brain searched for noise that never came. By the time confusion reached his feet, it was over. The alley returned to silence. Fog drifted back into place. Two bodies lay where certainty had been seconds before. By morning, the Germans would swear it was impossible. No witnesses, no reports of gunfire, no shell casings, just dead men in the middle of a controlled city. And somewhere else, far from that alley, British handlers would quietly mark another success. Another urban ghost story added to the growing pile of things the Reich could not explain. The weapon responsible looked like a mistake. It was short, thick, awkward. It had no elegance, no intimidation, no heroic lines. In the hand, it felt less like a firearm and more like a tool pulled from a plumber's bag. Cheap metal, plain grips, a shape that suggested compromise rather than power. And yet, in occupied cities, it became one of the most feared instruments of the war. Officially, it wasn't supposed to exist. It violated conventions, ignored battlefield norms, and erased the line between combat and disappearance. It was banned, denied, and never acknowledged in public doctrine, but in safe houses, in basement workshops, in whispered briefings between men who expected not to return. It had a reputation bordering on myth. It was ugly but deadly, harmless looking but devastating, a weapon designed not to fight wars, but to end moments. The Germans never gave it a proper name. They couldn't. You can't catalog something you can't hear. Reports spoke of officers killed without shots, of sentries found dead with no alarms triggered, of resistance fighters who slipped through checkpoints and left fear behind them like exhaust. To the men who carried it, this thing was freedom. To the men who hunted them, it was proof that cities were no longer safe. This wasn't a soldier's weapon. It was a city weapon, and cities were where the Reich thought it was strongest. Urban warfare broke every rule the Allies had trained for. Rifles were too long. Pistols were too loud. Suppressors helped, but not enough. Even a quiet shot echoed between stone walls, ricocheted off alleys, and summoned boots within seconds. Knives required proximity and strength. Garrities demanded time and control. Every solution exposed the operator to risk. Worse, failure didn't mean retreat. It meant interrogation, names, networks. Entire resistance cells erased in basements that never made records. The problem wasn't killing. It was surviving the kill. British and Allied planners understood the contradiction immediately. They needed a firearm that behaved like silence, something that delivered certainty without announcement, something that could be carried under a coat, used once, and vanish. German engineering focused on power and spectacle. The Allies went the other direction entirely. They stripped the idea of a gun down to its bare necessity. Controlled force, delivered quietly, at arm's length. What they built ignored pride. It ignored appearance. It ignored tradition. It solved the problem by refusing to look like a weapon at all. The breakthrough was brutally simple, but it only looks obvious in hindsight. Most engineers start with noise and ask how to reduce it. These designers did the opposite. They asked how to prevent noise from ever being born. Gunfire is loud for three reasons: the explosion inside the barrel, the rapid escape of hot gas, and the bullet breaking the sound barrier. Eliminate all three, and what you're left with isn't silence, but something close enough to pass for it in a city at night. The first decision was radical. The barrel itself would be sabotaged, not damaged, engineered. Small ports were drilled along its length, carefully spaced, precisely measured. As the bullet traveled forward, These holes siphoned off the expanding gases that normally explode out of the muzzle. Instead of erupting into open air, the pressure was bled away in stages, weakened before it could ever become sound. Those gases didn't escape. They were imprisoned. Surrounding the barrel was a massive suppressor, far larger than anything considered practical at the time. Inside, it wasn't complex machinery or clever springs. It was brutally physical, layers of rubber and fabric wipes. Soft materials designed to be destroyed. Each shot shredded them slightly, absorbing heat, pressure, and energy like a sponge soaking up violence. This wasn't a weapon built for longevity. It was built for missions. The wipes degraded quickly, which meant the suppressor had to be serviced or replaced. That was acceptable. This gun wasn't meant to fire hundreds of rounds. It was meant to fire one, maybe two, when everything depended on it. Then came the bolt. Automatic firearms are noisy even without gunfire. The clack of metal cycling, the spring tension snapping forward, casings ejecting and bouncing off stone floors. In a city, those sounds travel. In stairwells and alleys, they multiply. So the designers removed the problem entirely. The bolt was manual, no recoil operation, no gas system. Nothing moved unless the operator moved it. After the shot, the gun stayed still. No ejection, no mechanical signature. Silence wasn't a feature, it was the default. This did something else too. It forced discipline. One shot meant commitment. There was no spray, no panic firing, no second chances unless the user deliberately created them. The weapon trained its operator as much as it served him. Calm, close, certain. The ammunition completed the system. A bullet traveling faster than sound creates its own noise, a sharp crack that no suppressor can fully erase. So, the ammunition was loaded deliberately weak, subsonic, slow enough to stay below that threshold, but heavy enough to retain lethality at close range. This wasn't about range. It was about inevitability. At the distances this weapon was used across a desk, through a doorway, in a narrow hallway, velocity didn't matter. Placement did. The bullet didn't scream. It arrived. And by the time anyone nearby realized something was wrong, the moment was already gone. What resulted was not silence in the poetic sense. It was something more unsettling, a dull, muted sound, often mistaken for a dropped object, a slammed book, a footstep out of rhythm. In a noisy city, it disappeared into the background. That was the genius. The weapon didn't announce itself as violence. It disguised itself as normality. In stairwells, the sound never traveled beyond a floor. In apartments, neighbors heard nothing but the hum of occupation continuing as usual. In offices, guards outside rooms remained oblivious. The design looked crude because it rejected refinement. No polished surfaces, no elegance, no attempt to impress. Every choice was made in service of one outcome, making killing feel invisible. German engineers never walked this path. Their philosophy was rooted in dominance. Loud weapons asserted control. Rapid fire suppressed resistance. Intimidation was part of the system. Even their suppressed designs were compromises. Guns first, silence second. This weapon inverted the hierarchy. Silence came first. Everything else was optional. That philosophical difference mattered more than the mechanics. German occupation relied on visibility, uniforms, patrols, public displays of power. This device attacked the idea that power had to be seen to exist. It told resistance fighters something radical. You didn't need to overpower the occupier. You needed to make him uncertain. Once this weapon entered the field, German countermeasures failed almost immediately. Patrols listened for shots that never came. Investigators searched for shell casings that weren't there. Entire neighborhoods were interrogated after deaths no one heard happen. The city itself became hostile. Stairwells became threats. Offices became traps. Any closed door could hide someone holding a device that didn't look like a gun, didn't sound like a gun, and didn't behave like one. This wasn't engineering as spectacle. It was engineering as denial. Denial of warning. Denial of response. Denial of certainty. It didn't just kill men, it killed confidence. And that is why it rewrote the rules of occupation. Not by force, but by subtraction. By removing sound, removing evidence, removing the illusion that control could ever be complete. Night operations were where this weapon stopped being a design and became a rumor. In occupied cities, resistance fighters learned quickly what it could do. They learned how close they could get, how little movement was required, how a single decision could end a life without triggering a chain reaction of sirens, boots, and arrests. Missions that once required teams now required one person and a steady hand. In Brussels, a railway coordinator loyal to the Germans was taken out in his office after hours. Guards stood 20 feet away in the corridor. The door stayed closed. The lights stayed on. When the body was found the next morning, there were no signs of struggle, no bullet holes in the walls, just a man dead at his desk, as if the building itself had turned against him. In Lyon, resistance cells used the weapon during synchronized operations. One fighter neutralized a sentry, while another sabotaged communications lines. No alarms, no pursuit. By the time German command realized something was wrong, the city was already dark, phones dead, rail traffic halted. The killings weren't the objective, the silence was. Paris saw the most psychological damage. German officers began refusing evening meetings. Some insisted on keeping doors open. Others demanded escorts, even inside buildings they controlled. The weapon created a strange imbalance. The occupier had numbers, armor, authority, yet felt hunted. What made it worse was unpredictability. This wasn't a bomb that announced intent. It wasn't gunfire that warned of danger. It was absence. A guard would be alive at one moment, gone the next. No pattern, no sound, no opportunity to react. Resistance fighters adapted their tactics around that fact. They didn't need to flee immediately anymore. A single neutralization didn't trigger citywide lockdowns. That bought time. Time to escape. Time to blend back into crowds. Time to survive. Executions of collaborators followed the same logic. Public killings created martyrs and crackdowns. Silent removals created fear without spectacle. People stopped trusting protection. Some refused German offers altogether. Others quietly disappeared from the collaboration network, unwilling to gamble on a knock at the door that might never make a sound. German counterintelligence noticed something else too. Informants stopped talking. Not because they sympathized with the resistance, but because they no longer felt safe. A collaborator could be eliminated without warning, without witnesses, without even certainty of how it happened. That uncertainty infected everything. Patrols became heavier, slower, louder. Officers paired up, then moved in groups. Checkpoints multiplied. Curfews tightened. All of it drained manpower and morale. The Reich still controlled the cities on paper, but psychologically, control was eroding. Investigations led nowhere. Ballistics were useless. Forensic signatures were minimal. Interrogations produced rumors, not facts. Some blamed poison. Others blamed knives. Some insisted it had to be an inside job. No one guessed the truth fully, because the truth didn't match their expectations of what a weapon should be. Compared to German pistols, this device was unimpressive. Compared to American suppressed automatics, it was slower and clumsier. Even among Allied tools, it looked outdated, but it did something none of them could do consistently. It erased cause and effect. German suppressed weapons still sounded like weapons. American OSS tools often favored versatility. This thing favored certainty. It didn't care about follow-up shots. It didn't care about range. It cared about one moment, done correctly. That's why it never became standard issue. It couldn't. Armies fight differently. This weapon belonged to shadows, to basements, to people whose names wouldn't survive the war. When liberation came, the cities cheered, but the weapon vanished. Official histories focused on tanks, bombers, rifles. This device didn't fit the narrative. It was too quiet, too morally uncomfortable, too effective in ways that made people uneasy. So it went back into locked rooms and sealed files. Mentioned briefly, studied quietly, then ignored. But for a time, it changed how fear moved through cities. It proved that occupation could be resisted not with noise, but with restraint. Not with spectacle, but with precision. The Nazis feared it because they never heard it, never saw it coming, never understood how something so crude could be so final. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that mattered most. It was the idea behind it. That silence could be weaponized. And once silence learned how to kill, no occupied city ever felt secure again.